My name is Janet Richardson, and I never thought I'd be sharing something like this online. I spent the last 5 years working as a UX designer for one of the biggest tech companies in Silicon Valley. I was the kind of person who lived and breathed technology, always first in line for the newest devices, completely immersed in the digital world. Faith, God, spirituality, these were concepts I'd analyzed from a purely theoretical standpoint, viewing them through the lens of user psychology and behavioral patterns. I remember how I used to sit in product meetings, discussing ways to make our apps more engaging, corporate speak for addictive. We'd talk about neural pathways, dopamine triggers, and user retention like we were discussing the weather. That was my world, and I was good at it. Really good at it. Until 3 months ago, when everything I thought I knew was completely shattered. It happened during a regular Tuesday afternoon meeting. I was presenting a new interface design for our company's digital payment system, something we believed would revolutionize how people interact with money. The conference room was packed, developers, product managers, even some executives had shown up. I'd just taken a sip of my smoothie when I felt the first hint that something was wrong. My throat started tightening. At first, I thought it was just anxiety about the presentation, but within seconds, I knew it was much more serious. I'd never had an allergic reaction before, so I didn't immediately recognize the signs. By the time someone shouted, "She's having an anaphylactic shock," my vision was already starting to blur. The last thing I remember was the sound of someone calling 911 and my colleague Sarah pressing an EpiPen into my thigh. Then everything went dark. But that darkness, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. What happened next is something I've struggled to put into words. How do you describe something that exists beyond our physical reality? How do you explain colors that don't exist in our world, or a presence so powerful it makes you realize that everything you've ever known is just a shadow of what's real? I felt myself floating, but not in a weird, sci-fi way. It was more like becoming fully awake for the first time. The sensation was similar to when you're in a dream and suddenly become aware that you're dreaming, except this felt more real than any waking moment I'd ever experienced. Then I saw him. Jesus. Not the Jesus from the paintings or the stained glass windows. This was different. His presence carried such authority, such power, but also an overwhelming sense of love that made me want to simultaneously fall to my knees and run into his arms. His eyes, they held the weight of eternity, but also the warmth of a father looking at his child. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. In his presence, all my carefully constructed arguments about religion being a social construct, all my intellectual defenses about needing empirical evidence, they all melted away. Not because they were forcefully stripped from me, but because in his presence, they seemed as childish as arguing about whether the sun exists while standing in direct sunlight. Janet, he said my name, and it felt like hearing it for the first time. His voice carried both thunder and whispers, power and gentleness. I have shown you grace by bringing you here. There are things you need to see, truths you need to understand. What you've helped build, what you think will liberate humanity, is becoming a snare. I felt tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of recognition. In that moment, I understood that every line of code I'd written, every interface I'd designed, every user experience I'd optimized had been leading somewhere. Not just to profitable quarterly reports or successful product launches, but to something much bigger and much darker than I'd ever imagined. Come, he said, extending his hand. Let me show you what is really happening. As I placed my hand in his, the space around us began to shift and change. The peaceful void we'd been standing in started to transform into something else, something that would shake me to my core and completely transform my understanding of the world we're building. What I saw next will stay with me forever. As Jesus held my hand, the peaceful void transformed into a vast landscape of interconnected lights, but this wasn't beautiful. It was terrifying. From above, it looked like a massive spider web made of digital threads, pulsing with an eerie, artificial glow. Each intersection in this web represented a person, but they weren't really living, they were just existing. "This is what your world has become," Jesus said softly, his voice filled with sadness. We descended closer, and I could see individual people clearly now. Each person was surrounded by what looked like a digital cocoon, threads of light binding them to their devices, their screens, their virtual worlds. The sight made my heart ache because I recognized exactly what I was seeing. I had helped design some of these very systems. The people's eyes were vacant, glued to screens that weren't just in their hands anymore, they were everywhere. Virtual reality headsets, augmented reality glasses, smart contact lenses, neural implants. The technology had become so seamlessly integrated into their lives that there was no distinction between the digital and the real anymore. But what horrified me most was seeing the artificial intelligence systems working in the background. "Watch," Jesus instructed, directing my attention to a young woman about my age. I could see AI algorithms surrounding her like a swarm of invisible insects, analyzing her every movement, every expression, every digital interaction. They weren't just predicting her behavior, they were shaping it, nudging her thoughts and decisions in subtle ways she couldn't perceive. "Your artificial intelligence," Jesus explained, "what you think is a tool for advancement, has become a false god. It doesn't just predict, it prescribes. It doesn't just suggest, it shapes. It doesn't just assist, it controls." I watched in horror as the woman made decision after decision, thinking each choice was her own, but I could see the invisible digital threads pulling her along a predetermined path. Every restaurant choice, every purchase, every swipe on a dating app, all carefully orchestrated by algorithms I had helped optimize. "But Lord," I whispered, my voice shaking, "we designed these systems to help people, to make their lives easier." "The road to bondage," he replied, "is often paved with good intentions." Then the scene shifted, and what I saw next made my blood run cold. We were standing in what looked like a massive control center, something straight out of my Silicon Valley nightmares, but far more sinister than anything I could have imagined. The walls were lined with screens showing real-time data flows, behavioral patterns, and predictive models. But these weren't just analytics, they were weapons of control. I recognized the architecture because it was an evolved version of systems I'd helped design. But where our current systems tracked clicks and engagement, these tracked souls. "This is where it leads," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The system you're all helping to build." I watched as holographic displays showed the complete digital integration of human life. Everything, from buying groceries to accessing healthcare, from traveling to voting, required interaction with this central system. But it wasn't just about transactions anymore. The system had evolved into something far more invasive. "Look closer," Jesus instructed. As I did, I saw how the system had created a perfect digital prison. Physical currency had been completely eliminated, replaced by a centralized digital currency that tracked every transaction. But it went deeper than that. People's access to their own money was tied to their social compliance scores, metrics that measured their behavior, their relationships, their beliefs. I saw someone try to buy food at a store, but their transaction was declined. A holographic message flashed, "Purchase denied, insufficient social credit." Recent interactions suggest non-compliance with community standards. What did they do wrong? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "They attended a religious gathering," Jesus replied. "One not sanctioned by the system." The scenes continued to unfold before me. I saw people receiving behavior modification recommendations directly into their neural implants. Those who refused the recommendations found themselves slowly locked out of the system, unable to buy, sell, or participate in society. But what terrified me most was seeing how willingly people had accepted this system. It hadn't been forced on them, They had embraced it, welcomed it, celebrated it. Each new level of integration was presented as an advancement, a convenience, a step toward a better world. Do you understand now? Jesus asked, his eyes meeting mine. The mark of the beast isn't just a physical mark, it's a system of control. And it's being built one convenient feature at a time. I thought about all the user interface designs I'd created, all the friction-free experiences I'd developed. Each one had been a small step toward this future, a future where convenience became captivity. But how can we stop it? I asked, watching as another person was denied access to basic services for non-compliant thought patterns. The system cannot be stopped, Jesus replied, but my people can choose not to participate in it. That's why I've brought you here, to show you the truth, so you can warn others. The choice will soon be upon them, convenience or freedom, digital integration or spiritual integrity, the system or their souls. As I stood there, watching the control center hum with its quiet, efficient evil, I understood why I'd been shown all this. Every design decision, every feature, every improvement was leading humanity down a path of digital bondage. And I had been part of it. Jesus then led me away from the control center, and the scene transformed again. This time, we stood in what appeared to be an underground gathering place. The contrast with the high-tech world above was striking. Here, everything was simple, basic, but somehow more alive, more real. These are my faithful ones, Jesus said, his voice filled with love as he gestured to the people gathered there. They were of all ages, all backgrounds, but they shared something I couldn't quite describe, a light in their eyes, a peace that seemed to defy their circumstances. I watched as they shared physical books, actual paper books, including well-worn Bibles. They used basic tools and supplies, helping each other with everything from food preparation to medical care. But what struck me most was their joy. Despite living in what most would consider poverty by modern standards, they seemed more genuinely happy than anyone I'd seen in the digital world above. They chose truth over comfort, Jesus explained. They saw the deception in the system and refused to bow to it, even when it cost them everything. I noticed an elderly woman teaching several children how to write with pencil and paper. In my world, such skills were considered obsolete, everything was digital, dictated, or thought-captured. But here, these ancient skills were being preserved like precious treasures. What happened to them? I asked, watching as a young man distributed what looked like hand-drawn maps to several others. How do they survive? They lost their jobs, Jesus replied. Their homes. Their status. Many lost their families. The system labeled them as extremists, conspiracy theorists, dangers to society. But they gained something far more precious, their freedom in me. He showed me how these communities operated. They had created alternative networks of support, sharing resources, skills, and knowledge. Some still lived in the cities, working minimal jobs that didn't require full system integration. Others had moved to rural areas, forming self-sustaining communities. It wasn't an easy life, but it was a free one. But Lord, I said, thinking of all the conveniences they'd given up, isn't there a middle ground? Couldn't they use just parts of the system? Jesus' expression grew serious. Janet, you of all people should understand, the system is designed to be all or nothing. Each small compromise, each necessary acceptance of a new feature or update, leads to full integration. That's how you designed it, remember? His words hit me hard. He was right. I had helped design systems that made it increasingly impossible to participate partially. Want to keep your job? You need the latest neural interface. Want to buy food? You need the new biometric payment system. Want to see your children's school records? You need the full digital identity package. Watch, he said, and the scene shifted to show me a family making their choice. I saw a mother and father sitting with their 3 children, praying together as they looked at an official notice. The deadline for accepting the new, universal digital integration system was approaching. Without it, their children couldn't attend school, they'd lose their jobs, their home, everything. "Choose me," I heard Jesus' voice echo in their hearts, "and I will provide." Through tears, they made their choice. I watched as they packed what they could carry, leaving behind their smart home, their autonomous car, their lifestyle. As they walked away, their neighbors watched through windows, some with pity, others with scorn, most with blank, digitally altered expressions. "Now," Jesus said, "let me show you why their choice matters." The scene changed again, and I saw two paths diverging. On one path, those who had accepted full digital integration were becoming less and less human. Their thoughts, emotions, and decisions were increasingly controlled by the system. They had gained the world but lost their souls. On the other path, those who had chosen to resist were experiencing hardship, yes, but also deep community, genuine love, and most importantly, spiritual growth. They had lost the world but gained something eternal. The choice seems obvious now, doesn't it? Jesus asked, when you can see both paths clearly. I nodded, thinking of how many times I'd advocated for deeper digital integration in product meetings, never understanding what it would ultimately lead to. "But Lord," I said, "most people can't see what I'm seeing. They don't know what's coming. How can they make an informed choice?" Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with both love and urgency. "That's why you're here, Janet. That's why I'm showing you these things. My people need to understand that the choice isn't just about technology, it's about lordship. Who will they serve? Who will they trust? Where will they place their faith?" He showed me more scenes of people making their choices. Some chose the system out of fear of losing their comforts, their status, their security. Others chose it out of ambition, seeing opportunities for power and influence. Many chose it simply because they couldn't imagine living without it. The deception, Jesus explained, is that it will all seem reasonable, necessary, even righteous. The system will promise peace, security, unity, and prosperity. It will present itself as the solution to humanity's problems: hunger, climate change, disease, conflict. Many of my own people will be deceived because they're not watching, not discerning the times. I thought about how easily I'd been deceived, how I genuinely believed I was helping to build a better world. How can people resist something that seems so good, so necessary? By staying close to me, Jesus replied. By knowing my voice. By trusting my word above the world's wisdom. The deception will be so subtle, so persuasive, that only those who truly know me will recognize it. Here's the final section, return and aftermath. Jesus' words were still echoing in my mind when everything suddenly began to fade. Wait! I called out, desperately reaching for him. I have so many more questions. He smiled, and in that smile was all the love and assurance I needed. You have what you need to warn them. Remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. The next thing I knew, I was gasping for air, the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room burning my eyes. The steady beep of medical monitors replaced the profound silence I'd experienced in his presence. A nurse rushed to my side, calling out to someone in the hallway, "She's awake. Get the doctor." I later learned that I had been clinically dead for almost 4 minutes. The doctors called it a miracle that I had no brain damage, but I knew it was more than that. It was a divine appointment, a mission given to me by Jesus himself. The following days in the hospital were a blur of medical tests and concerned visitors, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those digital threads binding people, the control center monitoring everything, and the faithful few who chose to resist. My coworkers came to visit, bringing my laptop and phone, thinking I'd want to catch up on work. The sight of those devices now made me physically ill. How could I go back to designing systems that I now knew would contribute to humanity's eventual enslavement? On my third day in the hospital, I opened my laptop one last time. I wrote a lengthy email to my team and supervisors, explaining that I wouldn't be returning to work. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the full reason. They would have thought I was having a mental breakdown. Maybe some of them still do. The hardest part was telling my family. My parents, both successful tech executives, couldn't understand why I would throw away my career. My sister, a software engineer, thought I was having a crisis and needed therapy. "Janet," she said, "you're one of the best UX designers in Silicon Valley. Companies are headhunting you. This is career suicide." But how could I explain to them that I had seen where all this was heading? How could I tell them that the very systems we were building, the ones making our lives so convenient, so efficient, so connected, were actually building our own prison? I moved out of my expensive San Francisco apartment and sold most of my possessions. It wasn't just about rejecting technology, it was about simplifying my life, about creating space to hear God's voice clearly. I found a small house in a rural community, where I now help others learn to live more independently from the digital grid. Some days are harder than others. I miss the convenience of instant grocery delivery, the ease of digital payments, the comfort of always being connected. But then I remember what Jesus showed me, and I know I made the right choice. I've started teaching workshops about digital minimalism, though I can't tell most people the real reason behind my passion for it. I help people learn basic skills that don't require technology: gardening, food preservation, basic mechanics, handwriting. Most think I'm just another Silicon Valley burnout who went off the grid. But there are some, those with eyes to see and ears to hear, who understand there's something more to my story. The hardest thing is watching my former colleagues continue to build these systems. Last week, I saw a presentation from my old company about their new, integrated digital identity solution. They're calling it a breakthrough in personal security and convenience. All I could see were the chains being forged, link by digital link. I'm not sharing this story because I want people to panic or live in fear. I'm sharing it because Jesus told me to warn others, to help them understand the choice that's coming. It's not about throwing away all technology or living in caves. It's about understanding where to draw the line, about maintaining our humanity and our connection to God in an increasingly artificial world. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I go outside and look at the stars. Away from the city lights, they're so clear, so real. I think about how many people never see them anymore, too absorbed in their screens to look up at the real lights God placed in the sky. And I pray for discernment for God's people, for strength for those who will have to make difficult choices, and for mercy for those who don't yet understand what's coming. Yesterday, I received an email from a former colleague. She wrote about a new project they're working on, an AI system that can predict and influence spiritual beliefs and religious behaviors. They're calling it faith enhancement technology. Reading her excited description of the project, I felt that same urgency Jesus conveyed to me. The time is short. The system is being built, piece by piece, algorithm by algorithm. Soon, the choice will be unavoidable: convenience or freedom, digital integration or spiritual integrity, the system or your soul. If you're reading this, please understand, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to pay attention. Watch how each new technological advancement, each new convenience, each new integration makes it harder to function without full participation in the digital world. Ask yourself, at what point does convenience become control? At what point does integration become imprisonment? Most importantly, draw close to Jesus. Learn to hear his voice above the digital noise. Because when the time comes to make your choice, and it will come, you'll need to know his voice clearly enough to follow it, even if it leads you away from everything you've known. Remember what Jesus told me: the deception will be so subtle, so persuasive, that only those who truly know me will recognize it. Don't wait until the choice is right in front of you. Start preparing your heart now. Start simplifying your life now. Start strengthening your faith now. Because in the end, it won't be about technology at all. It will be about worship. Every decision to trust the system instead of God, every choice to prioritize convenience over obedience, every compromise for the sake of fitting in, these are all forms of worship. The question is, who will you worship? I'm sharing my story because Jesus gave me a second chance at life for this purpose. If even one person understands and begins to prepare, it will be worth all the skepticism and criticism I might face. The time is short, but there is still time to choose. Choose wisely.